The storm at 3:30. At 3:30 in the morning, on June 19, 1944, off the coast of Normandy, a British tug crewman stood on a wet deck and watched a steel roadway move in a way no roadway was ever meant to move. The channel was black around him. Not dark in the ordinary sense, not the soft darkness before dawn, but a hard, moving darkness filled with spray, engine smoke, and the dull metallic groan of things under strain. Every few seconds, a wave struck the side of the vessel and sent cold water over the deck. The man could taste salt and oil together. Somewhere beyond the spray, cables were tightening and snapping loose. Somewhere behind him, a voice came through a radio in broken fragments, swallowed by static before the sentence could finish. The harbor was supposed to hold. That was the idea. That was the promise written into the maps, the drawings, the timetables, the orders. A harbor built in Britain, towed across the English Channel, and assembled on the coast of France because the Allies had landed where there was no major port. Concrete boxes. Steel bridges. Floating pontoons. Old ships sunk deliberately to tame the sea. A port made not from geography, but from decision. But now, in the hours before dawn, the sea had begun to take it apart. At Omaha, where the Americans had fought through one of the bloodiest beaches of D-Day, the artificial harbor known as Mulberry was being hammered by the storm. Landing craft dragged at their anchors. Small vessels collided in the gray confusion. Floating roadways twisted and lifted. What had looked, on paper, like engineering discipline now looked terribly fragile. Men who had survived gunfire were watching supply lines break under waves. And that mattered more than it seemed. Because the invasion of Normandy had not ended on June 6. The men inland still needed ammunition. They needed fuel. They needed rations, radios, tires, plasma, bulldozers, spare parts, anti-tank guns, blankets, maps, batteries, bridging equipment, cigarettes, morphine, and thousands of tons of things no soldier could fight without for long. A rifleman in a hedgerow did not need to know the name of the harbor behind him. But he would know when the ammunition stopped coming. A tank crew did not care whether a roadway floated on pontoons or rested on stone. But they would care when the fuel drums ran dry. Somewhere inland, German officers still believed time might be on their side. They had not stopped the landing on the beaches. But perhaps the sea would stop what the Wehrmacht had not. Perhaps the Allies had made the mistake German planners had always hoped they would make, landing an army where no army could be properly supplied. That belief had seemed reasonable. Armies needed ports. Real ports. Deep-water ports. Harbors with cranes, warehouses, quays, railheads, roads, repair shops, and space enough to swallow the machinery of modern war. Normandy had beaches. Beaches could take men. Beaches could take courage. But beaches were not supposed to feed a continent-sized campaign. The storm pressed harder. A steel section rose, dropped, struck, and shuddered. Men shouted into wind that took half their words. A towline snapped like a gunshot. No one on that deck had the luxury of thinking in grand strategy. They thought in knots, cables, anchors, waves, engines, and the next 30 seconds. Yet in those 30 seconds lived one of the quietest questions of the war. Had the Allies really solved the port problem? Or had they only postponed disaster? For Hitler's generals, the answer had once seemed obvious. No captured harbor meant no lasting invasion. No port meant no army. No army meant the beaches would become a trap. But what they had not fully understood was that the Allies had already tried to imagine the impossible before the first landing craft touched Normandy. They had not only prepared to cross the sea. They had prepared to bring part of the sea's answer with them. And now, in the dark, with the storm rising and the artificial harbor beginning to break, that answer was about to be judged. Not by planners. Not by speeches. Not by maps. By water, steel, and survival. No port, no invasion. In German headquarters, the logic was plain enough to be comforting. An invasion of France would need a port. The officers did not have to be fools to believe it. They had studied campaigns, rail lines, tonnage tables, coastlines. They knew how modern armies consumed supplies. They knew that a landing force, no matter how brave, became weaker with every hour if it could not be reinforced. A division could fight on courage for a time. It could not move on courage. It could not fire artillery with courage. It could not repair tanks, evacuate wounded men, or feed thousands by belief alone. Modern war ate metal. It ate fuel first. Then shells. Then tires. Then men. And all of it had to come from somewhere. From the German point of view, the obvious place was a port. The Allies would need one quickly. Cherbourg. Le Havre. Calais. Perhaps another harbor along the French coast. Without that, the invasion might land, but it would not mature. It would remain a wound on the coastline, dangerous for a few days, then vulnerable, then trapped. The Pas-de-Calais made sense to German eyes. The channel was narrow there. The crossing was shorter. The route to Germany seemed more direct. The port logic was stronger. It was the kind of place staff officers could defend on a map with straight lines and clean arrows. Normandy was different. Longer crossing. Wider beaches. Fewer immediate port advantages. Difficult bocage country behind the landing area. Roads that could become clogged quickly. Tides that exposed and concealed obstacles. A coast that looked, in many ways, poorly suited to sustaining a massive army. That was part of its value to the Allies. But it was also part of its danger. The Germans had not forgotten Dieppe. No one who studied amphibious war in Western Europe could forget it. In August 1942, Allied troops had tried to seize a port on the French coast and had been mauled. The raid became a lesson written in blood and wreckage. A defended harbor could be a killing ground. The Germans drew their own lesson too. Ports had to be fortified, mined, prepared for demolition, and held long enough to deny the enemy what he most needed. The port was not only a place. It was a trap. The Allies also learned from Dieppe, but not in the same way. They learned that a direct assault on a major defended port might be too costly. They learned that a harbor could be destroyed before it could be used. They learned that the first days of any future invasion would depend on a supply method that did not require immediately capturing the very thing the Germans were most prepared to defend. German officers believed they understood the problem. They did. But they did not fully understand the answer being built across the water. In Britain, behind fences, under secrecy, in shipyards and construction basins, men were making pieces of something that did not quite fit the normal language of war. It was not a battleship. Not a tank. Not a gun. Not a weapon in the way soldiers like to imagine weapons. It was infrastructure. A temporary harbor. A port that would travel. To the men trained in traditional military geography, that idea sat awkwardly. Harbors belonged to coastlines. Ports were captured, defended, bombed, repaired, or destroyed. They were not packed into pieces and dragged across the sea under tow. But the Allies were not trying to win an argument about what a harbor was supposed to be. They were trying to keep an army alive. The German belief had a cruel simplicity. If the Allies landed without a port, logistics would crush them. If they tried to seize a port, German defenses might bleed them. If they delayed too long, the armored counterattack might come. If the weather turned, the sea itself could become an ally of the Reich. It was a sound belief. That is what made it dangerous. False assumptions are easy to dismiss after the fact. The more interesting ones are those that were almost true. In June 1944, the German assumption about ports was not foolish. It was rooted in everything armies had learned about supply, movement, and mass. It was rooted in the reality that no offensive could run on symbols. The Allies knew this better than anyone. Every landing table, every loading plan, every convoy route and beach dump showed the same hidden truth: D-Day was not a single day. It was a beginning that had to be fed every hour afterward. The first wave could seize sand. The second could reinforce it. But the third, fourth, fifth, and 100th wave had to turn that sand into a system. That system needed roads before roads existed. It needed piers before piers existed. It needed sheltered water where the open sea still rolled. It needed order where war produced only wreckage. And it needed men willing to trust a strange invention with the weight of an invasion. On the German side, the belief remained: no port, no lasting invasion. Across the Channel, Allied engineers were quietly preparing the reply. Not with slogans. With concrete. D-Day was only the doorway. The first men who landed on June 6 carried the story that would be remembered. They came through surf, smoke, mines, machine gun fire, beach obstacles, shouted orders, and the noise of a world breaking open. They climbed shingle, crawled through sand, crossed killing zones, and pushed inland one field at a time. That story deserves its weight. But behind it was another story, less visible and less forgiving. The landing was only the doorway. An army could pass through it and still die on the other side. By the morning after D-Day, the beaches were already becoming something other than battlefields. They were becoming supply machines. Not clean machines. Not efficient ones. They were loud, clogged, dangerous strips of wet sand where traffic control mattered almost as much as courage. Men shouted over engines. Bulldozers pushed wreckage aside. Military police and beachmasters tried to make lanes where no lanes existed. Trucks waited, stalled, reversed, sank, moved again. Landing craft grounded, opened ramps, spat out cargo, and struggled back into the surf. Ammunition boxes came ashore beside medical supplies. Fuel drums rolled in mud. Wounded men moved in the opposite direction, back toward ships, back toward England, if they were lucky enough to be moved in time. Everything had to move. Nothing moved easily. The tide changed the battlefield twice a day. A place that was usable in 1 hour became impossible in another. Sand that looked firm could trap a vehicle to its axles. Roads inland were narrow and choked. The hedgerow country behind the beaches waited like a green wall, giving the Germans cover and giving Allied logistics another problem. Once supplies reached shore, they still had to reach the front. A shell fired miles inland began as a crate on a ship. A tank attack began as fuel on a beach. A field hospital began as canvas, tools, blood plasma, water cans, and men who knew where to place them. War often remembers the final act and forgets the carrying. In Normandy, carrying became everything. The planners had tried to imagine it in advance. They had calculated tonnage requirements, vehicle schedules, unloading rates, traffic flows, beach exits, and ship movements. But no plan, however precise, could fully survive the first sight of the beaches after the assault. Wrecked landing craft lay in the surf. German obstacles remained half-submerged. Bodies and equipment marked the places where the plan had met reality. Smoke drifted over sand that already smelled of fuel, seawater, explosives, and torn earth. Some officers on the beach found that their maps had become almost insulting. A map showed a line. The beach showed a mess. And inside that mess, time mattered. The men inland could not wait while headquarters solved the perfect arrangement. The German army was still there. Counterattacks were expected. Artillery was firing. Roads had to be opened. Supply dumps had to be created. Units had to be fed forward before they stalled. The great fear was not always dramatic. Sometimes it was a simple question asked in a tired voice near a stack of crates. Where is the fuel? Where are the shells? Where is the engineer equipment? Where is the road clear enough to move? The Germans had built their confidence around this problem. They believed the Allied army would become heavier than its own supply line could bear. They believed the beaches would choke. They believed that without a captured port the invasion would become a stranded mass of men and vehicles, unable to expand fast enough. They were not imagining nothing. They were imagining exactly what could happen. The Allies knew the same thing. That is why the artificial harbors mattered. They were not decorations on the edge of the invasion plan. They were part of the survival plan. A way to reduce the dependence on open beach unloading. A way to move cargo from ship to shore with more order, more protection, more continuity. But before they could matter, they had to exist. That meant massive structures had to be towed across the channel in the wake of the invasion. It meant old ships had to be deliberately sunk in the right places. It meant concrete caissons had to be positioned in rough water. It meant floating roads had to connect moving pierheads to a beach still smelling of battle. There was no quiet construction site waiting in France. There was only Normandy. And Normandy did not care how clever the plan had looked in Britain. The men who had to make it work were not the generals whose names filled the official histories. Many were engineers, sailors, tug crews, construction workers in uniform, beach traffic men, mechanics, signal men, and officers with very little sleep and too much responsibility. They were the kind of men who noticed when a cable angle looked wrong, when a pontoon was taking punishment badly, when a truck was moving too slowly over a flexible roadway, when the tide was about to turn a small mistake into a disaster. They saw the war from close range. Not as arrows. As weight. And the weight was coming. The Germans believed the Allies needed a port. The Allies agreed. They simply refused to accept that the port had to be found on the French coast. The engineers nobody filmed. In Britain, before the invasion, the future harbor did not look heroic. It looked like noise. Hammering. Welding. Concrete pouring. Men in heavy coats standing in drizzle beside structures too large to feel real. Drafting tables under lamps. Cigarette smoke in rooms where engineers argued over joints, anchors, buoyancy, tolerances, and wave movement. Shipyards that had already given the war so much were asked to produce something stranger than ships. A harbor in pieces. There were no cheering crowds around most of this work. No newsreel voice explaining to the public what was being built. Secrecy wrapped the project. Even many who worked on parts of it did not always understand the full shape of the thing. They knew their section. They knew deadlines. They knew that failure would not be measured in embarrassment. It would be measured in men stranded across the channel. The project demanded a rare kind of imagination, not the romantic kind, but the practical kind. The kind that asks how steel behaves when the sea lifts it. How concrete floats before it is sunk. How a pierhead can rise and fall with the tide. How a road can move and still be a road. Somewhere in this world of drawings and tests, men such as Alan Beckett helped develop the flexible roadways that would become part of the Mulberry system. The whale roadways had to carry vehicles while floating on beetle pontoons. They had to flex but not collapse. They had to move with water while still persuading a driver that he could cross. That was a strange demand to place on metal. Most roads are trusted because they do not move. This one had to move enough to survive. The Phoenix caissons presented another challenge. These were enormous concrete structures, hollow and buoyant for towing, designed to be sunk in position to form part of the protective breakwater. They were not elegant. They were massive, blunt, industrial objects. But once lowered into place, they could help turn open water into something closer to shelter. Then there were the old ships. The gooseberries. Vessels no longer meant for glory, chosen to be deliberately sunk as block ships. A ship is normally saved from sinking. Here, sinking was the mission. The vessel's last service would be to die in the correct place, forming a line of protection for men and cargo behind it. It was a hard kind of usefulness. Piece by piece, the harbor became less an object than an argument. The Allies were arguing that geography could be altered temporarily. That a coastline without a port could be given one. That industrial planning could answer a military assumption older than the men making the plans. But not everyone would have found the idea reassuring. An artificial harbor sounded clever in a conference room. It sounded bold in a memorandum. But out in the channel, under tow, in bad weather, with enemy aircraft still a possibility and mines still a danger, cleverness would become weight and drag and risk. The tug crews understood this early. They would have to move large, awkward pieces across water that had never been a friendly place. A tug captain dealing with a caisson was not commanding a sleek weapon. He was managing momentum. If the tow went wrong, if the sea caught the structure badly, if a cable parted, the thing behind him could become unmanageable in seconds. No one needed to give these men grand speeches. They knew enough. Some of them had spent their lives around water. They understood that the sea has no respect for rank or planning. It does not become gentle because an operation is important. It does not care that the men inland are counting on you. That knowledge gave the work its quiet fear. The engineers were not naive. They knew parts would fail. They knew damage would occur. They knew assembly under real conditions would reveal flaws hidden by tests. But war rarely offers perfect instruments. It offers choices between dangerous options. After Dieppe, storming a defended port looked dangerous. Landing without a port looked dangerous. Building one looked ridiculous. So they built one. There is a particular kind of courage in technical work under pressure. It is not always visible because it does not announce itself. A man checks a measurement again. A welder finishes a joint that may carry more weight than anyone will ever know. A designer changes a detail because the previous version fails in his mind before it fails at sea. A tug crewman tests a line with hands already raw from work. Not dramatic gestures. Small refusals to let the system fail. By early June 1944, the pieces were ready enough. Not perfect. Ready enough. Across the channel, German officers still looked toward the coast and thought in terms of harbors that already existed. Ports to defend. Ports to deny. Ports the enemy would need. They did not see the full shape of the harbor waiting in fragments. They did not hear the welding. They did not smell the wet concrete. They did not watch the tug crews preparing lines. And they could not yet know that the most important port in the first weeks after D-Day might not be on any pre-war map of France. Bring the harbor with you. The idea, once spoken plainly, almost sounded like a joke told by a tired planner. If there is no harbor, bring one. But the men responsible for making that sentence real knew there was nothing simple inside it. A harbor is normally a place where geography has been made useful over time. Land, water, depth, shelter, quays, cranes, roads, rail, warehouses. A harbor is stone and dredging and labor accumulated across years. It belongs to a coastline. Mulberry had to belong to a timetable. It had to cross the channel after the invasion began. It had to be assembled off enemy territory. It had to function before a major captured port could be brought into full use. It had to accept ships, vehicles, cargo, movement, tide, and damage. And it had to do this while surrounded by all the disorder of an active campaign. The system was built from several ideas that had to behave like one. First, the sea had to be calmed. Not conquered. Calmed enough. Old ships would be sunk as breakwaters, forming gooseberries. Phoenix caissons would be towed into position and sunk to build stronger protection. Together, they would reduce the violence of the open water, giving landing craft and supply vessels a better chance to work. Then came the roadways. Whale sections, floating on beetle pontoons, stretching from pierheads toward the shore. They were neither ordinary bridges nor ordinary roads. They were floating arteries, metal paths laid across moving water. Vehicles would drive where no stable ground existed. At the end, spud pierheads would rise and fall with the tide, allowing cargo to move from ships despite the changing water level. That part mattered. Normandy's tides were not minor details. They were daily transformations. A fixed pier could become useless or dangerous if it ignored them. The harbor had to breathe with the sea. Each component had its own logic. Together, they formed a promise. Ships could unload. Vehicles could roll. Supplies could move. The army could live. But the promise depended on alignment, timing, weather, anchoring, towing, communication, and the patience of men who had very little patience left to give. One late tow could delay assembly. One damaged roadway could slow traffic. One caisson sunk badly could leave a gap. One unexpected storm could expose the entire system's weakness. No German general needed to ridicule the idea for it to be dangerous. The danger was built in. Imagine a driver seeing the roadway for the first time. He has driven on roads all his life, but not one like this. Beneath his wheels the steel does not feel like France. It has a living motion. A loaded truck ahead of him moves slowly, its cargo covered, its tires slick with seawater. Men wave him forward because there is no time to let fear become a traffic jam. He looks left and sees water. He looks right and sees water. Somewhere beyond the harbor, ships wait with more cargo. Somewhere inland, men wait for what his truck carries. He does not need the name of the engineer who designed it. He needs it to hold. That was the real test of Mulberry. Not whether it impressed the men who read about it later. Whether tired men, frightened men, practical men, would use it because the situation demanded it. Before June 6, the harbor existed in pieces. After June 6, those pieces began moving toward a coast still being fought over. There is a strange tension in towing something that cannot defend itself into a war zone. A caisson has no gun. A floating roadway cannot maneuver like a destroyer. A pierhead cannot hide. These things were heavy, slow, and essential. They depended on escort, timing, weather, seamanship, and luck. The channel crossing for the invasion had already demanded an immense naval effort. Now came the ungainly procession behind the assault, the materials of permanence dragged toward a temporary beachhead. The Germans had prepared for landing craft. They had prepared for tanks. They had prepared for airborne troops. They had prepared for naval gunfire. They had not built their central expectation around the idea that the enemy might install a working harbor on an open coast. And why would they? War encourages men to prepare for what has happened before. The Germans had seen ports attacked, bombed, defended, and denied. They had seen amphibious raids fail. They had reason to believe that port dependency was a hard rule. But the Allies were not breaking the rule with fantasy. They were bending it with industry. A rule of war is often only a description of what had been possible so far. In June 1944, possibility arrived off Normandy under tow. The first pieces did not make the coastline look safe. They made it look stranger. Sunken ships. Concrete walls rising from water. Steel paths on pontoons. Traffic over waves. A battlefield turning, awkwardly and urgently, into a harbor. For a few days, the impossible seemed not only possible, but practical. Then the weather changed. After the first wave. After the first wave, the beaches did not become quiet. They became crowded. The sound changed, but it did not soften. The sharpest gunfire moved inland in many places, though danger remained. In its place came engines, shouted orders, bulldozers grinding through sand, cranes clanking, landing craft ramps dropping, radios sputtering, and the constant laboring noise of a shore being forced to function. Men who had come ashore to fight now walked past stacked supplies that looked almost absurd in the open air. Crates, fuel cans, stretchers, coils of wire, boxes of rations, spare parts, medical stores. Everything looked temporary. Everything was vulnerable. A single shell, a wrong turn, a blocked exit, a rising tide, any of it could turn usefulness into chaos. The Mulberry components began arriving into this disorder. There was no ceremonial moment when the harbor became real. It emerged in stages, through labor. A blockship positioned. A caisson sunk. A roadway aligned. A pontoon secured. A pierhead adjusted. Men checking, shouting, signaling, correcting. In a planning room, sequence has a clean dignity. On the water, sequence becomes argument. The tug crews had to place massive pieces where the plan required them, while current, wind, damage, and traffic all pressed against precision. The sailors guiding old ships to their final sinking positions had to make a deliberate wreck useful. The engineers working near shore had to think like builders and soldiers at once. A mistake did not merely delay construction, it could block movement, endanger vessels, or reduce the harbor's ability to shield the very ships it was meant to protect. At Omaha and Gold, the two Mulberries took shape under different conditions and pressures. Mulberry A served the American sector. Mulberry B served the British and Canadian sector near Arromanches, later remembered as Port Winston. Both represented the same answer to the same German belief: if a port was necessary, the Allies would not wait to capture one. Yet the work was never separate from the larger fight. Behind the beaches, German forces were not finished. The bocage slowed movement inland. Roads became contested arteries. Artillery could still reach areas of the beachhead. Mines and obstacles continued to kill. The front line was close enough that men unloading supplies knew they were not in the rear in any comfortable sense. A beachmaster trying to direct traffic had to make decisions with consequences. A truck delayed in the wrong place could block other vehicles. A landing craft held too long could miss a tide window. Supplies unloaded in the wrong order could create piles of abundance beside shortages of essentials. War punishes bad organization quietly at first, then violently. The harbor offered hope of order. But it had to earn that hope. Early traffic over the floating roadways carried more than cargo. It carried confidence. Every vehicle that crossed proved that the idea could do something beyond impress planners. Every ton moved ashore made the beachhead less fragile. Every successful unloading helped loosen the grip of the German assumption. Still, no one who worked around the harbor would have mistaken early success for certainty. The system was exposed. The sea remained there, patient and indifferent. Men could repair damage from use. They could adjust lines. They could replace parts. They could work through exhaustion. But they could not negotiate with the weather. For several days after D-Day, the Allies drove supplies ashore with remarkable intensity. Landing craft continued to beach. Dukus and other amphibious vehicles helped bridge the gap between ship and shore. Trucks moved inland. Engineers improved exits. Supply dumps grew. The invasion widened its footprint. To an observer looking only at the movement, it might have seemed the crisis was passing. But the men who knew the channel knew better. Weather had always been the silent enemy in the invasion plan. Eisenhower had already delayed the landing once because of it. June 6 itself had been chosen through a narrow window. The sea had allowed the invasion, but it had not surrendered. By June 18, signs were appearing. The wind shifted. The swell grew. The water became less cooperative. Landing craft had more difficulty. Anchors dragged. Men working the harbor felt the strain change in the lines and joints. There is a way experienced sailors become quiet when weather begins to turn serious. Not panicked. Not dramatic. Attentive. The Allies had beaten the first German expectation. They had landed. They had not been thrown back into the sea. Supplies were moving. The artificial harbor was working. But the real test of any improvised system comes when conditions stop being fair. On June 19, the channel stopped being fair. And the harbor that Hitler's generals thought could never matter was about to face the thing even generals could not command. The storm that nearly proved them right. The storm did not arrive like a single blow. It built. That made it worse. At first, men could hope it would pass. They had seen bad weather before. The channel was famous for it. A hard wind, a rough sea, delays, all unpleasant, none necessarily fatal. Work could slow and resume. Ships could ride it out. Crews could curse, tighten lines, and wait for morning. But this storm kept pressing. From June 19 into the following days, the sea off Normandy became a moving field of impact. Waves struck vessels and harbor components with a persistence that turned every weakness into a widening failure. Landing craft were tossed and damaged. Floating roadways strained under forces they had not yet faced in combat conditions. Anchors dragged. Connections failed. The water filled with broken things. Mulberry off Omaha, suffered terribly. The same beach that had already become a symbol of human cost now watched another form of danger unfold. The harbor system there was damaged beyond practical repair. Sections broke apart or were rendered useless. Vessels were wrecked. The American artificial harbor, meant to help feed the army ashore, was effectively lost. For a moment, the old German logic seemed to rise out of the water. No port. No harbor. No stable supply. No lasting invasion. Not because German tanks had reached the beaches. Not because the Luftwaffe had swept the channel clear. Not because the Atlantic Wall had held. But because the sea had found a weak point in a plan that depended on fragile coordination between steel, concrete, weather, and men. It is easy, years later, to say that the Allies adapted. They did. But in the storm itself, adaptation was not a clean sentence. It was men soaked through, trying to save what could be saved. It was commanders receiving reports that made the situation worse each hour. It was cargo delayed when cargo was already urgent. It was landing craft crews watching vessels smash against obstacles or each other. It was the sickening sound of metal bending when no one had the strength or machinery to stop it. At Omaha, the storm did what German fire had not done. It broke the harbor. But the story did not end there. Farther east, off Arromanches, Mulberry was also battered. It was not untouched. No structure sitting in that sea could remain untouched. Damage occurred. Work was disrupted. Men fought to preserve, repair, and reorganize. But Mulberry endured. That difference mattered. Not because one harbor became a flawless miracle and the other a foolish failure. War rarely divides so neatly. The difference mattered because the survival of Mulberry proved that the concept could still serve the invasion. Damaged, strained, imperfect, but working. Port Winston, as it came to be known, became one of the strangest lifelines in military history. It stood where no natural port had stood. It accepted the punishment of tide and weather. It allowed ships to unload cargo in ways the open beach alone could not match. It helped sustain the Allied beachhead during the dangerous weeks before other port facilities could fully support the campaign. The Germans had believed a coastline without a port was a strategic weakness. They were right. But the Allies had made weakness negotiable. That was the reversal. Not that the sea was harmless. It was not. Not that the harbor was invincible. It was not. Not that logistics became easy. It never did. The reversal was harsher and more practical. Even after one artificial harbor died, the invasion did not die with it. The Americans, deprived of Mulberry intensified open beach unloading and adapted their methods. The British and Canadians continued to benefit from Mulberry. Across the beachhead, Allied logistics became a web rather than a single thread. That web was ugly, improvised, overworked, and sometimes dangerously strained. But it held. For German commanders waiting for the supply problem to become fatal, the realization could only come slowly. The expected collapse did not occur. The beachhead expanded. More men arrived. More vehicles came ashore. Fuel continued forward. Artillery kept firing. The invasion did not become lighter with time. It became heavier. That was the signal. The beaches had not trapped the Allies in the way German planners had hoped. The port problem had wounded them, delayed them, challenged them, but not stopped them. The sea had nearly proved the German belief correct. Mulberry A showed how close the idea came to disaster. Mulberry B showed why the belief still failed. Somewhere on those beaches, after the storm, a man could look at the wreckage and see defeat. Another could look at what remained and see the only thing that mattered. Enough. Enough roadway. Enough shelter. Enough repair. Enough men still willing to work. Enough tons moved ashore. Enough time bought for the army inland. In war, enough can be decisive. The German belief had depended on a clean failure, no port, no supply, no invasion. Normandy answered with a Messier truth. One harbor destroyed. One harbor surviving. Beaches still unloading. Men still moving. The army still alive. And now the question was no longer whether the Allies could land. It was whether they could feed the breakout that would follow. Tons per day. There is a kind of number that does not look dramatic until a man at the front runs out of what it represents. A ton of ammunition is not emotional on paper. On a gun line, it is time. A ton of fuel is not heroic in a report. Inside a Sherman tank, it is movement. A ton of medical supplies is not cinematic in a logistics table. In a field hospital, it is the difference between waiting and treating. Normandy became a campaign of tons. The artificial harbor at Arromanches helped turn ships into supply, and supply into motion. It did not carry the invasion alone. That would be too simple, and too false. The beaches continued to matter enormously. Dukus moved cargo. Landing craft came in through surf. Trucks crawled through sand and mud. Engineers opened exits. Men unloaded by hand when machines were not enough. But Mulberry B gave the system structure. It allowed cargo to move through a sheltered artificial port when open beach work was more vulnerable to weather and tide. It gave planners capacity where geography had denied it. It became a place where the invasion's appetite could be partially answered. And that appetite was enormous. Every mile inland increased demand. A unit that advanced needed more fuel to remain useful. Artillery firing in support required constant shell supply. Vehicles broke down. Tires wore out. Engines needed parts. Men needed food daily, not symbolically. A successful advance could become its own danger if the supply line could not keep up. The German army understood this. German commanders, especially those with experience on the Eastern Front or in mobile operations, knew that movement without supply becomes exposure. Tanks without fuel become bunkers. Guns without shells become decoration. Infantry without food, ammunition, or medical support becomes brittle. The Allies understood it too. What they possessed, more than any single device, was a capacity to organize material at scale. Factories, ships, depots, planners, engineers, drivers, sailors, clerks, mechanics, and laborers formed a chain so large that no one man could see it entire. Mulberry was one visible part of that chain, dramatic because it sat in the water and defied expectation, but still only part of the machinery behind the campaign. Reports later suggested that Port Winston handled vast amounts of cargo, vehicles, and personnel during its operational life. Verify exact tonnage and duration before final production. What matters is not only the number, but what the number reveals. The harbor was not a symbol placed offshore for pride. It was used. Day after day, it absorbed work. Imagine the rhythm. A ship arrives. Cargo is prepared. A crane swings. A load shifts. A vehicle inches forward. A man signals with tired arms. A truck rolls across a roadway that flexes beneath it. The driver feels the movement through the steering wheel, through his boots, through his spine. He does not think about German assumptions. He thinks about staying centered, not stalling, not losing momentum, not being the one who blocks the line. Behind him, another truck waits. Behind that, another. Behind that, a ship. Behind that, England. And ahead, France. That is how a harbor becomes history. Not in one spectacular moment, but in repetition. The same dangerous crossing. The same unloading. The same checks. The same repairs. The same argument with tide and weather. The same insistence that the army must be fed again today. Numbers can seem cold until they are broken into hours. If a roadway is down for 1 hour, what does not move? If a pierhead is damaged, how many trucks wait? If a beach exit is blocked, how far back does the congestion spread? If a storm delays unloading, how many artillery batteries begin to count shells more carefully? The mathematics of survival in Normandy did not leave much room for romance. It forced priorities. A commander might want speed inland. The supply officer might know the roads could not yet bear it. A frontline unit might demand more ammunition. Another might need fuel more urgently. Engineers might need materials to repair a bridge that would allow everyone else to move. Medical units might need evacuation routes cleared before more wounded arrived. Every decision had a shadow. That was the war behind the war. The Germans believed that the Allied army would have to obey the limits imposed by the coast. In one sense, they were right. Geography still mattered. Weather still mattered. Tide still mattered. Mulberry did not abolish nature. But it changed the calculation. It gave the Allies a way to push more through the system than the Germans expected. It helped prevent the beachhead from becoming a starving mass. It supported the long, grinding buildup needed before the breakout from Normandy could become possible. The battlefield truth was not that logistics replaced combat. It was that combat could not continue without logistics. A rifleman did not hold a hedgerow because a harbor existed behind him. He held it because he had ammunition, support, evacuation, replacement, and the knowledge, sometimes unspoken, that the army had not forgotten him. A tank did not break through because a pierhead rose and fell with the tide. It broke through because fuel reached it, parts reached it, shells reached it, and the roads behind it still functioned. Every ton moved through Port Winston joined the invisible pressure building against German lines. The Germans looked for the decisive clash at the front. The Allies also fought there. But behind the front, steel roadways were carrying another form of force. Slow. Heavy. Unphotogenic. Relentless. And the men who made it move were paying in exhaustion long before they were paid in recognition. The men beneath the miracle. The harbor looked different from above. From an aircraft, it might appear almost orderly, lines of vessels, breakwaters, roadways, tiny moving vehicles, the geometry of a temporary port imposed on the sea. From a map, it looked cleaner still. Symbols. Names. Routes. Zones of responsibility. At eye level, it was harder to romanticize. Men worked wet. They worked tired. They worked with salt drying on their skin and oil on their sleeves. They worked near winches that could take fingers, cables that could kill when they snapped, vehicles that could slide, loads that could swing, and water that punished hesitation. A tug crewman guiding a heavy structure did not experience Mulberry as a triumph of Allied planning. He experienced it as pressure in a line, engine vibration underfoot, shouted corrections, and the knowledge that the thing behind him did not forgive mistakes. A driver crossing a floating roadway did not feel like a participant in a grand engineering achievement. He felt the road move. He heard the tires hum and slap against wet metal. He saw the truck ahead shift slightly and corrected his own steering without thinking too much about what waited on either side. A beachmaster watching traffic did not have the luxury of awe. His world was blockage, flow, delay, priority. He had to know which vehicle moved next, which lane was failing, which load could wait, which could not. A few bad minutes could create a knot of machines that took hours to untangle. The human cost of such work is easy to understate because it is not always counted in dramatic casualties. Some men died. Some were injured. Some were lost in accidents, weather, mines, or enemy action. Verify specific casualty examples if using named individuals. But many more paid in strain. Sleeplessness. Cold. Fear held in the body until it became routine. The dull mental narrowing that comes when a man has worked too many hours and still cannot stop. War does not only break men in battle. Sometimes it wears them thin beside a cargo net. A medical orderly waiting for supplies did not care whether history would remember the harbor. He cared whether the plasma arrived. Whether stretchers could move back. Whether the wounded would spend another hour too long in the wrong place. A mechanic waiting for a spare part did not care about the theory of artificial ports. He cared whether a vehicle could return to service before a unit needed it. A gun crew waiting for shells did not praise the harbor by name. They simply fired because the ammunition arrived. That is the strange fate of logistics. When it works, it disappears. No one at the front says, the supply system has performed adequately. They eat. They fire. They drive. They survive another day. The miracle becomes ordinary because it has succeeded. But for the men behind it, ordinary was brutal. The harbor demanded constant attention. Repairs had to be made. Damage assessed. Traffic managed. Weather watched. Loads balanced. Communications maintained. The enemy still existed. The sea still existed. Exhaustion could not be allowed to become carelessness, though it often tried. There is a photograph one can imagine, though many such images exist in different forms, a man standing beside a stack of crates on the Normandy shore, his face dark with grime, eyes narrowed against wind, helmet pushed slightly back, not posing, not smiling, not performing heroism. He is simply there. The work has not ended. The next load is coming. That man is part of the harbor as much as the concrete. The Germans believed in the vulnerability of an army without a traditional port. They had studied the material problem. They had not entirely misread it. But what calculations often struggle to measure is the stubbornness of ordinary men inside a system that must not fail. Not glamorous stubbornness. Practical stubbornness. The kind that says, move the truck. Tie the line again. Patch the section. Clear the beach. Unload the crates. Keep going. The men beneath the miracle were not all volunteers in the romantic sense. Many were simply assigned to work that became enormous because history placed weight upon it. They did not need to believe they were changing the campaign. Some may not have known the scale of what depended on them. But dependence does not ask permission. It settles on shoulders anyway. And when the story of Normandy was later told, many of those shoulders disappeared into the background. The beaches had names. The airborne divisions had legends. The generals had memoirs. The tanks had photographs. The infantry had stories of hedgerows and villages. The harbor remained visible, but the labor inside it became harder to see. That is often how war remembers support. It praises the spearhead and forgets the hand that kept passing it forward. Yet if the supplies had failed, everyone would have noticed. If fuel had stopped, if ammunition had thinned, if medical evacuation had broken down, if the buildup had stalled, the missing work of those men would have appeared instantly as disaster. Their success made them quiet. And quiet things are often stolen from memory first. The port that wasn't supposed to matter. Recognition came, but not evenly. Mulberry entered the official story as one of the great engineering achievements of the Normandy invasion. It was too large to ignore, too strange not to mention. Port Winston, at Arromanches, remained in use long enough to become part of the campaign's material foundation. Visitors after the war could still see remnants in the water, mute concrete shapes resting where the sea had not fully erased them. But public memory has its own preferences. It remembers men running through surf. It remembers paratroopers in the dark. It remembers generals at map tables. It remembers tanks entering villages, flags raised, prisoners taken, cities liberated. A harbor does not fit the heroic shape as easily. It has no single charge. No one final shot. No face at the center. Its drama lies in continuity, and continuity is difficult to turn into legend. A harbor wins by working again and again and again, until the crisis it prevented becomes hard to imagine. That is why Mulberry can be both famous and underfelt. Known, but not always understood. The German realization, if we speak of it carefully, was not a single moment when a general slammed his hand on a table and admitted defeat. War does not usually provide such clean theater. It arrived through reports, delays, observations, the absence of expected collapse. The Allied beachhead did not wither. It thickened. The expected logistical paralysis did not arrive in the form needed to defeat the invasion. German forces fought hard, and the Normandy campaign remained bitter and costly, but the beachhead continued to receive what it needed to survive. The old belief had been damaged. No captured port immediately available. Then bring temporary port capacity. One artificial harbor destroyed. Use the beaches harder and preserve the other. A storm interrupts supply. Repair, adapt, reroute, unload again. This was not elegant. It was not invulnerable. It was not the clean triumph that simplified history sometimes prefers. The Allies struggled in Normandy. They suffered delays. They faced shortages and congestion. Cherbourg, once captured, was heavily damaged and required repair before it could serve fully. The supply picture remained complex and difficult. But the basic German hope, that Normandy without a major port would become unsustainable quickly enough to decide the campaign, did not hold. That is the battlefield truth. The floating harbor did not have to be perfect to matter. It only had to help prevent failure during the window when failure was still possible. Official reports and post-war engineering histories gave Mulberry its place. Churchill's interest in the harbor concept became part of the story. Engineers and naval planners received recognition in some circles. Museums preserved pieces. Arromanches became a site where visitors could look out and see the remains of an idea that had once seemed almost absurd. Yet many of the people who made it work remained anonymous in the larger public memory. The driver on the floating roadway. The sailor on the tug. The welder in Britain. The engineer adjusting a connection. The beach worker moving cargo through exhaustion. The man who did not call the idea genius. He called it the job. That gap between importance and memory is not unique to Mulberry. War is full of systems that vanish behind the battles they make possible. Railways. Repair depots. Fuel pipelines. Code rooms. Field hospitals. Convoys. Engineers. Drivers. Clerks. Mechanics. They do not always appear in the painting. But remove them, and the painting burns. Mulberry also forced a deeper recognition inside military thinking. It showed that a defended coastline could be approached with more imagination than a direct grab for an existing port. It showed that the attacker could bring infrastructure, not merely troops. It showed that industrial power could reshape the opening phase of a campaign in ways a defender might not expect. The Germans had built much of their logic around denying what already existed. The Allies answered by creating what did not. That distinction is easy to miss. A destroyed port can deny an enemy. A temporary harbor can deny the denial. The surviving harbor at Arromanches therefore became more than a construction achievement. It became an argument about modern war. The battlefield was no longer only the visible front. It extended back through factories, shipyards, design offices, training grounds, loading plans, weather rooms, and convoy lanes. The side that could coordinate all of that could make choices the other side did not consider practical. For Hitler's generals, Normandy had looked like a place with a missing port. For Allied planners, it became a place where a port could be temporarily imposed. The map had not changed. The meaning of the map had. And long after the trucks moved on, that lesson remained in the water. Modern war is built before it is fought. The remains at Arromanches are quiet now. Concrete sits in the water like broken teeth. At low tide, shapes emerge that once carried the urgency of an army. Tourists look out from the beach. Some know what they are seeing. Some only see ruins. The sea moves around the remnants with the same indifference it had in 1944. That silence can make the harbor seem smaller than it was. But in its brief life, Mulberry spoke clearly about the direction of modern war. It showed that battles are built long before they are fought. Not only in the minds of commanders, but in yards, depots, workshops, and plans that appear dull until the shooting starts. The floating harbor was not improvised after D-Day because someone suddenly noticed a problem. It was prepared because someone had looked at the problem early enough to fear it properly. That is rare. Armies often learn too late. They discover in battle what they should have understood in planning. They realize that a road is too narrow only when the convoy stalls. That a bridge is too weak only when the tank cannot cross. That a port is destroyed only after the first ships arrive. That a landing beach cannot feed an army only when the men inland begin to wait. Mulberry was an attempt to learn before the catastrophe. It did not avoid every catastrophe. The storm destroyed Mulberry A. The systems suffered damage. Normandy logistics remained difficult. But the existence of the harbors showed that Allied planning had taken the port problem seriously enough to attempt a solution at the scale of the problem. This is where the story reaches beyond Normandy. Modern military power is not only firepower. It is the ability to arrive, remain, repair, feed, fuel, and continue. A force that cannot sustain itself becomes a dramatic photograph and then a cautionary tale. A force that can sustain itself becomes pressure. It keeps returning. It keeps firing. It keeps replacing losses. It turns a landing into a campaign. The Germans knew this truth, but by 1944 they increasingly lacked the industrial and logistical freedom to answer it at the same scale. They could still fight with skill and ferocity. German units in Normandy made the Allies pay for fields, roads, villages, and hedgerows. But the Allied system behind the front was becoming too large, too adaptive, too material to be defeated by the old expectation alone. A temporary harbor did not make Allied victory automatic. Nothing did. But it represented the kind of war the Allies were now fighting, a war where engineering and industry could create options faster than the defender could close them. The legacy of Mulberry lives in that principle. Military planners after the war studied amphibious logistics, temporary infrastructure, modular systems, offshore unloading, and the challenge of sustaining forces across hostile shores. The specific technology changed. The lesson endured. A coastline is not only a line of defense. It is a problem of movement. The side that solves movement changes the battle. And yet the human meaning remains. It is tempting to admire Mulberry as an object, the caissons, the roadways, the pierheads, the scale. But objects do not work themselves. Men had to imagine them, build them, tow them, sink them, repair them, drive across them, and trust them under conditions that made trust difficult. The Germans believed the Allies would be bound by the old shape of the coast. The Allies brought a different shape with them. Not permanent. Not graceful. Not immune to failure. But enough. Enough to keep men supplied through the fragile early phase. Enough to prove that the lack of a traditional port did not have to decide the campaign. Enough to make a beach behave, for a time, like a gateway rather than a trap. That is why the remains at Arromanches matter. They are not simply ruins of wartime construction. They are the bones of an answer. An answer to a question asked in German planning rooms, Allied design offices, and on the beaches themselves. Can an army survive where geography says it should not? In June 1944, the answer was not written in one bold stroke. It was written in tons. In cables. In wet steel. In the hands of men who kept working after the sea had shown them what failure sounded like. What really happened? By the time the storm passed, the men off Normandy had seen enough wreckage to understand the sea's verdict. It had not spared the plan. It had tested it. One harbor was effectively lost. Another survived wounded. Beaches kept working. Trucks kept moving. Ships kept arriving. Inland, the Allied armies fought through hedgerows, villages, artillery fire, fear, and delay. The breakout would not come easily. Nothing in Normandy came easily. But the invasion remained alive. That was the fact that mattered. Return to the man on the wet deck at 3:30 on June 19. He would not have seen the full arc of history from where he stood. He would not have thought in terms of doctrine or legacy. The wind was too loud for that. The deck too slippery. The cable too dangerous. The next task too immediate. He saw a roadway twisting. He heard metal complain. He felt the sea trying to pull apart what men had assembled. And in that moment, the question was not whether the idea had been brilliant. The question was whether enough of it would remain by morning. That is the truth inside many wartime inventions. They are not judged in the clean air of theory. They are judged in mud, salt, smoke, fatigue, bad weather, poor visibility, broken communications, and the small mistakes of exhausted people. They are judged when the enemy does not behave as expected. When the weather changes. When the map loses its authority. The Mulberry Harbors were imperfect. That must be said clearly. One failed under storm damage. The other endured but required constant labor. Beach unloading remained vital. Allied logistics succeeded not because of one magical device, but because many systems overlapped and men adapted when parts failed. But imperfection does not erase significance. In war, the decisive thing is often not the perfect solution. It is the solution that survives long enough to matter. Hitler's generals believed the Allies needed a captured port before they could sustain a major army in France. Their belief was logical. It rested on the hard requirements of modern war. It nearly found support in the storm that wrecked Mulberry. It was not a foolish belief. But what really happened was stranger. The Allies brought a harbor with them. They built it from concrete, steel, sunken ships, floating roads, calculations, weather risks, and the labor of ordinary men. The sea broke part of it. The rest kept working. And through that battered, temporary system, enough of an army continued to pass from ship to shore, from shore to road, from road to front. A beach became a port. Not forever. Long enough. The old belief said geography would decide. The battlefield reality said men could sometimes alter geography, briefly, at terrible cost, if they feared failure early enough to prepare for it. Today, the water at Arromanches moves around the remains without ceremony. The waves do not explain what happened there. The concrete does not speak for the men who built it, crossed it, repaired it, or cursed it in the dark. But the shape is still there, half buried in tide and memory. A harbor that was not supposed to work. A lifeline that was never meant to last. A temporary answer to a permanent rule of war. Armies do not survive on courage alone. They had believed Normandy was a beach without a port. But what really happened was that the Allies brought the port across the sea, and for a few decisive months, reality moved on floating steel. Final CTA. If you are watching from a place connected to the Normandy landings, or if someone in your family served in the war, share it in the comments. These stories survive because people keep asking what was believed at the time, and what the battlefield finally revealed. If this documentary gave you a different view of D-Day, share it with someone who knows the beaches but not the harbor behind them. And subscribe to WW2 Combat Files for more forgotten stories of the machines, decisions, and ordinary people that shaped the war in ways history does not always remember.